This episode was made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 111 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
and then see the movie.
I'm James.
And I'm Luke.
And this week, we discuss Zack Snyder's 2009 film, Watchmen. So Luke, this is a controversial one. This is one that I feel like a lot of people think about when they think of adaptations, and because it is very divisive. I feel like it splits people.
Yeah, good point. I think this is going to be one where pretty much no matter what we say in this episode, we are going to have people vehemently disagreeing with us one way or another. And it's hard to predict because I agree. This seems like all over the place. When I've talked to people about this movie, my own feelings about this movie have changed over time in some ways. It's a really interesting adaptation, and definitely excited to talk about it. But yeah, I mean, it will probably stir the pot a little, I imagine, with our listeners.
Well, I think just in adapting it, you're never going to please everybody with this. You can never, even if they did all of the things that we are going to mention, whether it was good or bad things that we would have changed or had the same, even if they did everything perfectly for us, someone else would disagree. This is just one of those projects that I don't think you could ever have everyone happy with.
Yeah, that's a good point. And my experience, as I alluded to earlier, my experience has kind of changed with this movie, and watching it this time after reading the graphic novel was night and day different for me.
Yeah.
And I was blown away by how different it was. And I don't know if that's a good thing in retrospect, because I watched it the first time knowing nothing about the graphic novel, right? And I sympathize with people who maybe did not connect with this movie because they had no previous knowledge of the source material, because I always felt kind of like that. I thought it was just okay. I don't really get why, what's the big deal is. And I watched it with my wife, and she hated it. She thought it was boring. She didn't connect with any of the characters. She kept asking me, like, why do I care about this? What's the point? And even after me kind of like setting the stage and talking to her about like what the graphic novel was. So it's I sympathize with that. You know what I mean? Because I think this was a movie designed to please graphic novel fans, and whether or not it fully succeeded in that we can talk about. But in a lot of ways, I think it alienated a lot of people who didn't know the source material.
Well, it's funny because I found myself this time thinking, like, who is this movie for, right? Like, if you're producing a film and making it, you're like, what's my audience? Who am I speaking to specifically? And it does feel like it was made for the graphic novel readers. It's very long. Yeah. It really takes its time to like show some things that were, time was taken out of in the graphic novel. But at the same time, I know for a fact there were decisions that were made that did not make graphic novel fans of the graphic novel happy. So It's like, who are you trying to please here? I think it's like maybe splitting it and trying to please a broad audience and also the comic audience may have led to some of this stuff. But it's really interesting because I want to know your history with it as well. But when I first saw Watchmen, I hadn't read the graphic novel, and then I read the graphic novel after seeing it, and then eventually I watched the film again. The first time I watched it, did not like the movie. Thought that it really just didn't have anything going for it. And I don't know if it was like where I was at personally, but I knew everyone said how good the graphic novel was. So I was like, I have to figure out why it's so good. So I went and read the graphic novel and then watched the movie again and enjoyed it a lot more, actually. But I think now I'm so split. It's crazy because I do think that I enjoy watching this movie, but there are just a couple of decisions that were made that made it so frustrating.
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems like you're maybe a little bit more advanced in your progression than me, because essentially I saw it when it came out in theaters. I remember the people I was with were very split on it. I think a few people really liked it. A few people really, really hated it. I was more in the middle of the road. Like, there were things I liked, things I didn't like, thought it was okay, kind of forgot about it. And then honestly, I think I've seen pieces of it since, but never actually sat down and watched the entire 3-hour director's cut like I did like I did this time.
Oh, that's also good to mention as well. Is like you said, I saw it in the theaters as well, and the theatrical version versus the version that we actually watched this time is the director's cut. So
Yeah,
you know,
different.
it is different.
Yeah, I mean, and that is a good point. But this time, having read the novel last week and talking about and analyzing it, my appreciation for the novel is through the roof. Like graphic novel, I loved it. I hope you'll go back and listen to our previous episode if you haven't already. We had on Spoonbender's author Daryl Gregory come on. He talked with us about Watchmen and his experience with it, and I just had a blast covering that. And so I went into this movie excited for the material, and sure enough, it was thrilling to see a lot of this stuff on screen, and I felt like all these like moments of, oh, look at that, that's just out of the comic. Look at this, it's like visually just right, and like there were so many times that they tried to match things perfectly, and for the most part that all worked really well. And so I enjoyed the experience of watching the entire film in a way that I didn't the first time, and mainly it was for those moments of like, oh, look how he captured this, and look at what he did here, and a lot of that was really cool.
Yeah, I think everyone would say that Zack Snyder did pull the comic book panels and put them on screen, and I mean, he said it himself. Like his storyboards were literally the graphic novel. Like he was like, I want to frame the shot exactly like this. I want it to progress just like this. And you know, things were taken out, things were changed in order to have the pace. You know, it still, I think, took its time, but ultimately this story was always made to be a miniseries. It was always made to be very long form. And I feel like with a 2.5 hour, 3 hour movie that we just watched, and then into another cut that they have as well, that's even what's well beyond that, the ultimate cut, you're talking about like, it is a miniseries at that point, and to sit through it as one episode, to think of it as one full feature length thing, I don't know. I think it's going to play differently to an audience, because there's something about watching a miniseries and having a conclusion to each chapter in that miniseries versus like, and the same thing with the graphic novel, the conclusion to each chapter of the novel, each issue of this graphic novel. And then to have it all play out in real time in front of you with no sort of breaks and no sort of time to think about it and reflect, I think does hurt the pacing of the film. But if you are a comic book fan and you're a fan of this material, you're going to be like, oh my, like you're saying, like, oh my God, everything is completely pulled from the page onto the screen, and it looks incredible.
No, I completely agree with that. And I had the note that this comic came out across 12 issues over the course of a year, coming out monthly, approximately. And that is how, in my opinion, this should have been done. It should have been 12 episodes, at the minimum 6 episodes. Maybe you combine 2 issues per, right? And that's your building blocks. You look at the issue, because it's a self-contained story to some extent. It usually had some sort of plot arc to it that wrapped up by the end of the issue. And if you would have done that, you could have introduced these characters step by step. You could have introduced their backstory step by step. You wouldn't have lost people, because there's so many characters. They each have their own character arc, and there's so much plot all happening in a condensed amount of time. It's just too big. Yeah. And I think this is a clear example of a novel or a work that really should have been in a different form. It shouldn't have been a movie. It should have been a series, whether that's like a limited series or a TV series, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the first missteps. I grant that maybe you wouldn't get the funding that you got for the film if you had done a TV thing. So things maybe wouldn't have looked as good. But I think the story would have been better served just in a longer form.
Well, I mean, and like in the version that we watched, the Tales of the Black Freighter isn't in it, the director's cut. But they also shot, it's an animated film that they have, it's Tales of the Black Freighter. I think in the ultimate cut, what they do is they cut in Tales of the Black Freighter into the movie that we just watched. So like,
not a good idea.
I mean, you're making the movie even longer, and like as much as I want that to be in there because it was so important to the story of the graphic novel, just thinking of it in an episode format, like you can easily thread that kind of stuff in, and maybe like think of all the history that's built into the graphic novel. We get it all as like montages almost, and like people talking about the history, which I think is great for the fans, the people who love the backstory and know all the backstory going in. But for other people, it's just like, holy shit, what is happening in this montage? And as cool as that montage is in the very beginning, it's super, super cool. I think it's great. How hard is that for somebody to follow if you don't understand what's going on?
So I agree that opening montage is really good. It's actually one of my favorite moments, but I also agree that it's dumping a lot of information on you, right? And you don't really know why it's important and how it connects to what you just saw in the opening scene with the comedian. But before we get into that, I actually want to touch on that Black Freighter stuff, because I think that highlights a problem with this adaptation that I was noticing. Now, he doesn't put the Black Freighter into it, which I think is a smart decision not to. It's interesting that it's in this ultimate version. I think that's a misstep, but the reason being that the Black Freighter in the comic is a comic in a comic. So it is a meta conversation about the art form that you are experiencing. If you take a comic and you translate it into a cartoon, and you put a cartoon in a live action film, you're removing steps of art forms, right? You're distancing things.
You're removing context too, so it's like historical comic context would then turn into historical cartoon context. So you'd be thinking about
way different. Yeah, so it just doesn't work. It's an instance where you look at something on the surface and say, oh, I'm just going to do the same thing that was in the comic, but you have to recognize that's not going to work the same way because of the differences in art form. And the way that was talking in a meta way about what it is to be a comic and all that stuff, right? You're not going to get that same effect.
It's also like how comics reflect our world and how the comic was reflecting that world. But I do think in terms of like reflecting the actual plot and story in Watchmen, it would still be cool to get some of that Black Freighter stuff just to kind of put context towards like in the end Ozymandias's plot or his like situation is similar to the sailor who's isolated on his own and then commits all these atrocities and then ultimately is left alone again because he's ostracized by humanity.
I think it is certainly interesting in the same way that it worked in the graphic novel, but I just don't believe it fits in this movie. And I think the decision to cut it was a right one. I think you can include it as a bonus feature on your Blu-ray. And if someone wants to go watch the animated film you made, they can go do that. And you know what I mean? They might love it. But I just don't think it should be in the actual movie that people are in the theater to watch, right? But I wanted to tie this back to a general idea I wanted to explore with this adaptation. So I was watching a YouTube video earlier this week about adaptations. I think it was an older video by Lindsay Ellis, which I think you're familiar with who she is. And in that video, she quoted I believe a critic who said this. This is critic Thomas Leach. The book will always be better than any adaptation because it is always better at being itself. So I want to explore that a little bit. I think it's a very interesting quote. I don't know that it's always true, but I think the sentiment behind it is a good one. The idea that when something is first and it's the originator and it is itself, often when you have an imitation come after as an adaptation, it's how can it be better than the thing that it's imitating, right? Like how it's never going to be as good as the thing because the thing is authentically itself. And I think that whether or not that applies to all adaptations, I think it does apply to this one. Because to me, Zack Snyder was trying to make a very authentic, almost slavishly so, adaptation of this graphic novel. He made some changes, but in general, it was very, very close. And in doing that, I think it's going to fail because the graphic novel is just always going to be the best version of that story. If you know what I mean? And where this video goes is it goes on to talk about how when you make an adaptation, it needs to change for the new form that it's in, right? And that's the way I think to get around this is you kind of invent a new thing in the shape of the original thing, but you make it its own. You use the language of the medium that you're now using instead of the written word. You're now using film as a language, and you embrace all of that, and you try and do something different. And so a lot of our favorite adaptations are like that, right? Where we've talked about it rises above in a certain way. So what's your thoughts on that and how it applies to this movie?
This is ultimately where I land with this stuff. So obviously in a legendary instance of Watchmen, which is universally basically known as the greatest graphic novel of all time, yes, it's going to be you probably will never have an adaptation that's better than that. But I would also pose certain projects that we've done like Die Hard, where we get like Nothing Lasts Forever, and then that's just like a kind of a read it and throw it away type book. And in terms of like it's a quick thriller that like there's not a ton of subtext, there's not a ton of things going on underneath it, and then you can play with it and change it, like you said, make it something new. But at the same time, when I look at an adaptation, I don't see adaptation as like copying exactly what is in the text. Like a good adaptation doesn't necessarily mean like every single plot point has been completely recreated. It's more the intention. So if you can take the intention of the original art and advance it and enhance it, I think you can do that in a film, and you can make an original source material enhanced because you're building on the foundation of something great, and you can create something new and different, like you're saying. But ultimately, it's like, obviously it's very hard when something like this comes along, and it's very clearly like breaking through a medium, and it's like making a generation of people fall in love with comics, and it's like a revolutionary story. You're probably never going to make an adaptation that's better than it.
Well, and this is, I think, a endorsement for adaptations that change things. And it's not saying that changing things will always be better. Like you talked about Die Hard, that took a book that was a crime novel, like a kind of a gritty crime novel about an aging guy and his relationship with his family, and maybe a little more than that. And it turned it instead into an action movie starring a likable hero who quips jokes, and you know what I mean? So like it changed the story fundamentally. And it wasn't this, like, it wasn't Nothing Lasts Forever. We're making it and we're putting it into a movie. It was a different thing, right? And I think that sometimes it's definitely a high risk, high reward situation. But when you're changing something to a film, reimagining it can be the path to having success. And I don't know. It's interesting because I felt like Zack Snyder really here tried to be as authentic to the source material as possible. It was a love letter to the source material in a lot of ways, but it failed to, I think, translate to the movie perfectly, because in some ways how sort of beholden to the source material he was.
So I don't know. I don't think the reason that this movie didn't do as well as it could have done, or in terms of just like being beloved to people, I don't think it was the fact that he'd adapted it so closely. I think it honestly comes fundamentally down to not completely understanding the intention of what the book was trying to get across, because he took the characters that are supposed to be like flawed humans, and they're supposed to be the same as everyone else, but they just have something in them that makes them dress up and go fight crime and like, try to push society in ways that they see as like just ways. I think that giving them actually enhanced powers, I think, puts them above everyone that they're fighting against in this story, right? So like everybody that they go up against are normal humans, and they're just punching the shit out of them. And it's like they're butter to them. They're cutting through them like butter. Mm-hmm. And I think that is like a pretty large misstep in terms of getting across what the graphic novel was about. Was just that like it was specifically about humans and being human. Right.
No, I mean, and I get that. I think honestly, this is like, I don't know. I feel like this is very theoretical stuff we're talking about here, and I'm also not saying that, like, philosophically, I believe that this is how adaptation should go and this is how adaptation shouldn't go. And it's just more that, like, I think this is an example that backs up some of these feelings that was evoked by this quote itself, where it was like, yeah, if you're going to try and reproduce something on screen in a different art form, but try and keep it as authentic as possible, the things that get lost in translation are always going to hold you back. And in my opinion, some of that is what you're talking about. Like he translated it into a movie that needed action, right? So he was trying to appeal to that side of the form, he thought. And some of this stuff, it gets muddied in the translation. And it almost would have been better, to something that Daryl talked about when he was with us, to try something wholly different and like set it in a different time period and take more license. And maybe you'll miss, and maybe people will be upset. But in some ways, you also might succeed. And that's one of the things that maybe this is too early to talk about this, but I'm excited for the new TV show because that's what it's doing. It's going somewhere new with the story, and I'm really excited to see what a vision like Damon Lindelof has brings to this world and this story. So, and I know it's not a true adaptation, but still, you know what I mean?
Right. I don't want it to seem like I don't agree with what you're saying either, though, because I feel like very clearly it is the case a lot of the time. Like the source material is like, it is tough to adapt it and to make it better. You can make a serviceable adaptation, but it's in terms of eclipsing the original material is going to be hard to do.
Yeah.
Basically across the board. So yeah, I do agree with that. And I also agree that this, I mean, I'm so excited for the show because I really feel like the intention is being thought of and kind of what Watchmen meant to Cold War era America and like what it meant to the world at that point for that story to come out, and sort of like worrying about nuclear deterrence and like is there going to be some sort of apocalypse like somewhere nearby. And seeing the trailers for this new show coming out, it's very clearly going to be grounded in race relations and sort of like anonymity and like how you can say things without necessarily having to show your face and this kind of thing.
Well, and masked vigilantes is sort of a real thing going on right now. If you look at a lot of the protests that are going on, right? Like you have masks on both sides, you have people fighting in the streets. And how do we feel about that? And is there a time in which that's appropriate, or is it always inappropriate? And I hope that this show explores that. And I think taking it and reconceptualizing it for our current moment in time, I think is really a cool idea. But let's focus back on this movie, because there are a couple things that I thought it was interesting, like some of the notable changes that were made, and some of it I don't know if I agree with. And one of them is the sort of look that the movie has, and it's become a very sort of like a staple of Zack Snyder, and that's this dark look that he loves. And I was comparing it, like I pulled the comic out after watching it and showed my wife, like compare like when Dr. Manhattan is on Mars, or compare how this looks when they're walking through the streets of New York.
Well, like Rorschach constantly, like with the neon lights and like reflecting off of water and all this stuff. Yeah, very colorful. It's
bright, and the colors are sort of saturated in a way. The Martian landscape really pops, and instead we get all the colors are subdued. Everything is sort of cast in this shadow. I like a good dark movie as much as anyone. Like I think Seven looks beautiful in dark, right? And it's appropriate for that material. But in this movie, I wanted some of that lightness back, and it doesn't make the story less grim and dark in its own sense. The story, the what you're actually getting, but the look of it doesn't have to be so sort of monotone. Because I think it actually robs some of the power out of some of these scenes a little bit.
Yeah, I want to put it in context of when it was coming out as well. So like, I'd like to talk about Zack Snyder in a second, but I agree with you. So he's matching these shots, but there is that like desaturation. There's like the lack of color, the darkness, and he's trying to show the underbelly of society. But there's part of what I think Alan Moore and Gibbons were trying to do is show like even in a world where there is color, and even in a world where like it doesn't have to be hidden and feel like underbelly and like very like grim and dark and all these things. It can be like everyday situations that are just like completely devoid of humanity, even though that seems like an everyday thing. So let's jump back, because I want to talk about Zack Snyder, the filmmaker. He is an American film director, producer, and screenwriter. He made his feature film debut in 2004 with a remake of the 1978 horror film Dawn of the Dead. Since then, he has done a number of comic book and superhero films, including 300, Watchmen, Superman, which is Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice, and Justice League. There are other movies in there that we can talk about here and there, but we've kind of seen, I'm sure everyone's familiar with Zack Snyder at this point. And a lot's been said about Zack Snyder, and I kind of want to know, you've said a little bit of like what you felt in this movie, but just like overall with like cultural context, like what you've seen people say and like your own opinion of the movies that you've seen of his, like how do you feel about him? And maybe start with like because I know you said that you've seen Dawn of the Dead. Maybe start there. Yeah,
and I think I liked Dawn of the Dead okay. I remember not being in love with it, but finding it entertaining. He really became a figure that I took note of during when 300 came out. That was a movie that also adapted from a comic, right? Like a Frank Miller comic, is my understanding. Obviously based off of true events, but more adapted from the comic itself. And I mean, that's a stylish action film that was fun, and it hit me at the time in my life where I thought it was really super cool. And I think by modern standards, you look back at it and it's pretty problematic. There's definitely some racism baked into it, some sexism too. Although, Spartan culture, women were powerful in certain ways. So it's a mixed bag, I guess I would say, if I'm being gracious. I still think it's a fun movie visually. And I remember being struck by the vision that Zack Snyder had for these moments in movies, and these just beautiful cinematic moments that you'll never forget. Like, I'll never forget the look of the arrows of the Persian army blotting out the sun in 300, and you'll never forget the guy kicking the other guy into the well. Like, there's things that you've seen in a Zack Snyder movie that you'll never forget, and there are moments like that in this movie as well. And I have to give him credit for that, because that's not something you can just do easily, right? Like, there's so many movies that I will forget everything that happened in the movie. I'll remember that I saw it, but I won't be able to like remember a scene. That happens to me, and that doesn't happen with Zack Snyder movies in general, because there are iconic moments. Beyond that, I think his style started to wear on me over time, and it started to becoming like it wasn't evolving enough, and I wanted to see more coming from him in later movies. And I know we're not talking about his entire filmography here, we're talking about Watchmen. And here, I think this is actually one of the better moments for his look, his style, and I don't think that is what holds him back here in general. I think it's more the approach to the adaptation, in my opinion. But, I don't know. That's general kind of random shit I'm thinking of here. Stream of thought. What's your thoughts on Zack Snyder and his movie making?
So yeah, I mean, just to start it where he started, I saw Dawn of the Dead and really liked it when it came out. I remember like it really hit me at the perfect time. And then rolling into 300, I remember seeing 300 in theaters and just being like, this is like, this is a new voice. This is like a different sort of style. And like you say, I mean, it hit me at the perfect time for that as well, because it was just like, I was, a young teenager, and it was the coolest thing. It was like crazy action, and, I wasn't really digging that deeply into like what all was going on there. Yeah. But like you talked about, there's like a scene, like he sort of made a style to himself. There's like the slow-mo that he's great at, and the sort of like, I'll never forget the scene where like Leonidas is like pushing with all the other Spartans, and it's like this like side tracking shot, and like it's just like it's sped up and slowed down and sped up and slowed down, and it's like punching in and pulling out, and like that is Zack Snyder. And in terms of like vision, I think that it's very clear that he has it. Like, he can see what looks good on film, and like he has a certain kinetic nature to his filmmaking. And then we start moving into Watchmen, and I remember, like I said, I saw Watchmen and I just really didn't like it the first time I saw it. And I think more than anything, it was that I didn't understand all the context of what was trying to be said in the movie. And then, like I said, I went and read the comic and then came back to it and appreciated it a lot more. But I think that Watchmen marks a certain amount of, it's a great moment for Zack Snyder to show kind of his strengths and his weaknesses, because his strengths are, when given material, when given these like epic moments and characters, he can do a lot with them. But I think some of his weaknesses come about when there's not a full 100% understanding of the material. And I think we see that carry over into his superhero stuff, because I was a big comic book guy, and so pushing into the DC stuff, I think that as we move forward, we don't have to fully get into all of it, but I just think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding for a lot of those characters in a lot of his movies. So it's like Superman was turned into like this, everyone's talked about it. I don't want to keep parroting things that people have said before, but basically like that's never the vibe, that's never the tone for Superman. Like, you can try to do that, but it's like, if you're doing that, you're telling a specific type of Superman story.
Well, explain that a little bit more, what you mean.
So like Superman, in the way that people feel about Captain America right now, like Superman should be a symbol that people strive for. Superman should be this character that like stands their ground and like is a hope that people look at, never to be feared, more to be like just like he's a savior basically. And people play with that a lot, and I think that's makes some of the most interesting Superman stories. But specifically, like, he represents hope, and like that movie does not speak hope. It mostly speaks like
You're talking about Man of Steel.
Man of Steel, yeah, dark action, sort of a lot of what we saw with Watchmen, and maybe influenced by a lot of what we saw in Dark Knight.
I was going to say, I think he might be in. Oh yeah, that's interesting too. The Christopher Nolan. I thought you were going to say influenced by Watchmen, because I see traces of him, his the way he feels about Dr. Manhattan, translating over into the Superman stuff, because we talked about in the comics how Dr. Manhattan is sort of the Superman character of the Watchmen universe, and I wonder if that affected it at all, if he had sort of Dr. Manhattan in his mind at all with any of the Superman stuff.
So, I mean, this kind of gets back into some of the stuff I was saying in our episode with Dale Gregory, but like this sort of idea, because then I'm shooting to Batman with Batman v Superman. Like there's just this misunderstanding. I feel like he thinks that Batman is Rorschach in some ways. I think that he thinks like Batman is like, that's the edgy version of Rorschach that the edgy version of Batman that he would like to portray. But getting back to what I said in the episode was, I think that there's some misinterpretation that happens. Like, so whereas I think very clearly in Alan Moore's book, the comic book, the graphic novel doesn't love these characters. They are characters in the novel, but it's not glorifying any of it. Right. It's just showing it as it's happening. And I think what happens here with Watchmen and what happens with Batman v Superman and Man of Steel a lot is this like glorification of violence sometimes, and this glorification of like these, like with Superman and Batman and things like that, they're supposed to be badass and they're supposed to be cool and somebody that like you're identifying with, or somebody that you're like oh my gosh, that's somebody to idolize. And then you're taking that character like Batman, for instance, and turning him into like a Rorschach character, which very specifically Rorschach is not supposed to be somebody that you idolize, because he's so extreme, because he's so on his own in a way that's like, he could become unhinged, or he could be dangerous to the point that like it's his. And Batman could be seen as this way as well, but I think there's a distinction to be made between what Alan Moore was trying to do and what typically Batman and Superman are trying to do. So when you get into Batman being a Rorschach character, or Rorschach being like an idolized version of what Rorschach should be, whereas he should be extremist and like, very cool and compelling character, not someone you should idolize. Whereas this film, I think, is shot in ways and is kind of placed the characters in certain situations with the slow-mo and the cool punching and like the really cool action scenes. And it just feels to me like there's some misinterpretation with like what that was supposed to mean. And I think like Rorschach turns into a character that people are like, that's a cool character, I like that character, I want to like imitate that character, if you're not understanding exactly what's being said. So I think it's just, I guess that's my long way of saying there's like a misinterpretation with a lot of the characters that goes on moving forward. But that's not to say, I also see people who are like, either DC haters or really big DC fans who will say like, I guess big DC fans wouldn't say this, but like there's this thing that like people think Zack Snyder's just like dumb guy, and he just like is a bad director in general. And I don't really like that idea, because I don't think you can put the stuff on screen that he does and be a bad director. Clearly he has vision. Clearly he can get these things to look incredible, and he's had good movies. So I think that I'm not a huge fan of when there's a lot of like really passionate people about Zack Snyder on both sides that are like really, really for him, and like they scream it from the mountaintops. So I don't know. He's very polarizing, and I'm sure like people won't agree with some of the stuff that I've been saying, but I would love to see. I'm really excited to see some of these DC films not necessarily influenced by Zack Snyder stuff, and maybe get into more of like, the new Batman film that's going to be coming out with Robert Pattinson has Matt Reeves as the director, and like they're getting a lot of great actors around them, and I think that it's like getting back to the world's greatest detective. So I'm really excited to see that stuff. Let's move back into the Zack Snyder stuff here. I also feel like he has some stuff with like over-sexualizing women in a lot of his movies, and I think that this movie has some of that as well. Whether it was the intention that was also in, because I think there was a little bit of that with Alan Moore and Gibbons with their story. There was like kind of treating these female characters as like sex is their primary motivation in this story. So I guess it's there in both adaptations, but I think that it's notable because there are other movies where that's very much in keeping with some of the female characters that Zack Snyder has.
So there's a lot there for me to react to. I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about your misinterpretation comments. I think it's interesting, right? Because we're talking about the relationship between the consumer and, you know, the viewer and the thing that they're experiencing. And I don't know, I guess I feel a little uncomfortable saying people are misinterpreting things because by the nature of art, like, you're allowed to interpret it however you want. And so if someone looks at Rorschach and wants to idolize them, you know what I mean? Like, that's up to them. It's like, who am I to tell them that they can't do that? But what I think backs up what you're saying, and I think what is lacking in this movie, is that we talked about it last week. Every character has their own worldview and their own philosophy and their own morality. And in the graphic novels, each of those viewpoints is presented, and then we get like a counter viewpoint, and it gets analyzed and it gets questioned by other characters. And there are flaws that are pointed out every time. And it felt to me like that was lacking in some of this stuff. Like you said, like, you get Rorschach being the badass, and you get him wrecking people and murdering people and being this sort of like over the top vigilante. And you get a little bit of maybe pushback from Night Owl here and there, but for the most part, you don't get a lot of it. And in his interactions with the Shrink, I feel like he's portrayed as like silly, like, oh, you know, he's like, oh, I just can't help him. And I felt like there was more nuance to those scenes in the graphic novel where he was pointing out things that were maybe true about Rorschach's worldview that didn't work. And it's just some of that nuance is gone. And so because of that, the material you're seeing and the art that you're getting doesn't contain within it alternating viewpoints and like point counterpoint. And instead we get a lot of like, Rorschach's awesome, just go with it. We get, you know, it's just like different things like that, where I think in particular that character, I would have liked to see some more of the other side of like, maybe the things he's doing are not great. And have that present in the film, and then it's up to you what you want to latch on to.
Right, and I think we do get some of it in his journals when he's kind of like monologuing and narrating some of the scenes. We hear like how he thinks about certain types of people and the kinds of things that he.
But that's only a problem if you don't agree with it, right?
Exactly. Well, that's what I mean,
Yeah.
and ultimately, yeah. If you're, yeah, I guess that's true. But that's what I'm trying to say is like, I just think it's tough in terms of these two specific things, which is superheroes typically are like just, for the most part, and people see them as this an idol, as I've been saying, and then in this situation, clearly Rorschach's a cool character. Clearly, there's a lot of cool stuff that goes on, but like you say, we almost get less of sort of his bias as well, because we start to see some unhinging in the book more. I feel like we start to see like he is biased and he is making decisions based on what helps or you know, what he feels in the current moment. So it's not like he says like, I'll never falter even in the face of the apocalypse, and all this stuff is really cool. And like that idea that he's willing to pursue his sense of justice to that point is really cool. But at the same time, he doesn't stick to that. So he's not an honest character, and he's not like, you know, it's like he's not to be taken at face value from the things that he says, because we see his actions and they don't necessarily reflect exactly what he's saying.
What actions in particular are you saying don't reflect that?
From the comic book specifically, one of the scenes, he finds the guy has pills or whatever, right? He finds that his old nemesis has pills, and he's like, I'm gonna turn you in for this, and he's like, no, please don't turn me in. I'm dealing with cancer treatment, this and that. If Rorschach really did stand by everything he said with his sense of justice and everything, the fact that he had illegal drugs, he would turn him in, but he doesn't, because that's his own bias. He makes an exception. He makes a decision that doesn't go along with his creed specifically. So he
is a little bit of a hypocrite. I think that's a good point. Let's move past Rorschach a little bit and talk about some of these other characters. I did notice, while we're still talking Rorschach, the combination of him and Night Owl together as a unit really does represent Batman. It's like you have Night Owl, who represents like the gadgets and the sort of nerdiness and the money and the intelligence of in many ways of Batman, and then you have Rorschach, who is like the brutal, violent, strict moral code, creeping around in the night, doesn't have the gadgets but doesn't need them. Ninja-like violence almost, even though they both have a little bit of that. But it's interesting how I think it's very notable that those two characters are partners and that we see them traveling around together and working together to solve problems because they are almost two halves of Batman.
Yeah, and I will say that like some of those scenes really worked for me too. Like the scenes of them together and like knowing their history from the graphic novel and like kind of bringing that to the film for myself. Yeah. And I think I don't know if I've said it enough, but reading the graphic novel really does enhance this film. Clearly, we've said really that. Does. But it really does to the point that I enjoy this film. Like I said, I think that...
Which is funny because I feel like we've been almost exclusively critical.
Right, which is why I'm trying to say this, is like, I do think that there is a lot to like about this film. I think that... I think it's a good watch, and I think there's like great morality in there, and there's sort of like things that make you think. And maybe it doesn't hit the mark that the graphic novel does, and that we're kind of pitting the two against each other at this point. But as an experience, doing both together, I think is really fun. And like there are decisions that I don't necessarily agree with, but I think it's cool that this exists, and we're able to see like a filmed version of this.
Yeah. So there's a few just random moments I want to touch on in this movie. One was, although I don't think Black Freighter should have been included, I love that we saw the guy selling the newspaper and the boy reading them, and we see them embrace when the blast goes off, and like just that little nod, like it's just a throwaway moment for most people, but if you've read the comic, you get why that's so cool.
Right.
So that kind of stuff all works.
That actually makes me think of another part that we've already touched on a little bit, but the montage with Bob Dylan singing "Times Are Changing" and everything.
I love that montage.
It's really good, man. Yeah. And like Bob Dylan, you put Bob Dylan in something, and to speak to the soundtrack specifically in this, it's so great. And like Bob Dylan's one of like the greatest artists of all time, and it was awesome, man. And like to see that sort of like loss of innocence and everything we talked about that's built in, it is there. And if you wanted to freeze frame it and go like a little bit at a time, you could really figure out exactly what is being represented there. And I think it does a really good and efficient job, especially if you know what's going on. Otherwise, it can kind of fly by, and it all happens really quickly. But
well, and I think the comedian is an interesting character because in both the graphic novel and in the movie, he's so reprehensible. And I remember my wife saying something like, this guy is terrible, and he is, but I remember saying like, oh, he's a little bit morally gray, but then she was like, what? In what way? Like everything he's done has been awful. And it's true. I think maybe there was a little more in the graphic novel, or maybe I'm just reading into it. Maybe the fact that he was going to reveal he was going to be a whistleblower, and that's why he got killed. So you give him maybe a little bit of credit for that, but she's right. Like everything he does is terrible, so why do we care that he got murdered? I don't know. I want to throw that to you. What did you think of that in the movie? And is that a problem with the movie? Because I think that I think she started to disconnect a little bit when it became apparent that the guy who died like was a terrible person.
Yeah, and but I think that's the point of the graphic novel, right? Like he's always supposed to be a horrible person anyway. But I think it's the reason. It's because we're interested in characters that are both light and dark, right? So it's like people who struggle with these things. He is clearly a piece of shit human being, like awful person. But there, not everyone is 100% evil. There's humanity in most people, and we start to see some of the humanity in him, and like he's clearly made some of the worst mistakes you can make. But I don't know. It's like the history with the group, maybe some of that built into the universe, and like you say, like it does seem like he was kind of, even though he'd been such a hand of the military for such a long time and always a follow orders type of person, the fact that he was flipping on his own moral compass at that point and was willing to start to spread the word. It does seem like he was trying to do things that are good. Ultimately, I think he's still, like, even if he was going to do something good, he's a piece of shit. But
I think symbolically he's very interesting because to me, we touched on this last time, and I think this is very apparent here, that Watchmen can be seen as sort of an indictment of the American dream and the American like ethos that we see.
Well, they basically say that in the in both adaptation and source material as well.
And it comes out of the mouth of the comedian, right? In one point particularly, he says, the American dream came true. This is it. And in some ways, he sort of embraces it, and so he's reprehensible. But in other ways, it seems like he's aware that the evil and the terrible things he's doing is sort of a reflection of society and a reflection of what he's being asked to do, and he's being the sort of person that he thinks our society wants. And that's why, to me, I describe him as sort of a dark Captain America. And I think in that sense, that's what he is, because he represents this like fascistic, brutal side of the government that some people embrace.
Well, he has the same sort of moral code that he lives by that Rorschach does. It's just in a different situation. So like you could see Rorschach different in a different situation and upbringing, maybe being pushed in a direction like this as well.
Well, I think the difference for me is that Rorschach's morals are self-made, self-driven, right. Whereas to me, the comedian is truly his is all coming from the top down. Like, this is what right. the government wants, so I'm going to do it. This is what society expects, so I'm going to do it. This is what I see work in our world. Like, we're crime fighters. This is what we're supposed to do. Like, I don't know. Like, a lot of it is to me like he's sort of shrugging off responsibility and laughing about it, because he's like, this is just what I was asked to do, so it's all fair, in the eyes of the law.
And that kind of gets into his thing about it's all a big joke. It's all bullshit. I think it's interesting and notable that he's an arm of the military and the government, because it's like, what does that say about, like heroes, people who are seen as heroes because they're following orders and because they're doing what needs to be done in certain situations. And I don't know. It's obviously there's a big commentary being drawn there.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but did we see the scene where it looks like the comedian killed JFK in the graphic novel, or was that added?
Oh no, I think it was implied though. I think it was implied. Like there was some sort of I don't think we get it directly, but we sort of get like when we were realizing that he's been used for the government. I think maybe in one of the chapters after the issue, you know what I mean? In one of the like Hollis type things to add context to the world, the sort of after stories. I feel like it has something. There's something maybe in one of those or something where it's kind of hinted at in the same way that it's kind of hinted at that I think the comedian killed Hooded Justice.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, and we get the implication that he also sort of like helped cover up Watergate, so that didn't come out. Right. And so he, in that sense, if you look at him as a figure that is sort of suppressing, like these are like JFK is a liberal figure, right? And the exposing the corruption of Nixon, who was a conservative president, right? And in a lot of ways, like he's this like a cudgel that is keeping down liberalism in America. And it's interesting how this world, like everything, liberalism is equated with being bad, and it's equated with commies and socialists and all this stuff, right? And like we were talking about in the graphic novel versus the movie, I feel like the graphic novel uses that and shows it to you, but the way that it's juxtaposed with everything else that's going on and a lot of the evils that we can clearly see in society, it's very apparent that it's saying, like, is this actually good? Because in many ways, this is the America that everybody wants and people think they want. But you can look at it and say something's wrong here. And I think he was trying to do the same thing in the movie, but for whatever reason, maybe slightly less effective.
Well, I will say that like Rorschach outwardly says things, anti-liberal things as well about like sort of like, and I think it's sort of like you're saying, there's something built in with like, and I think if what I understand is right, there's like, Rorschach in some ways doesn't do anything or say anything to the comedian because he sees him as following his own moral code as well. Like he's a hero. He's a military man who's following orders and doing the things that need to be done in a society that's unjust and like left to their own devices. Is involved in like prostitution and murders and racketeering and all this stuff. And that's how Rorschach sees the world. So he sees like any sort of order where people are following a certain code, I guess, because I feel like there's sort of a kinship between the two. That's like kind of unspoken, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just reading into that.
Well, let's move on from these characters. I think we've spent a lot of time on them. Let's talk about Dr. Manhattan because in some ways, I think it's some of the best stuff in the movie. And then there's also some notable differences. What was your take on Dr. Manhattan in this movie?
Really quickly, I did want to just give us the opportunity. I thought that the casting of Jackie Earle Haley was perfect for Rorschach, and I actually read that he campaigned for the character. He wanted to play the character so bad that he was campaigning and going around. I just thought that he was really well cast as Rorschach, and the voice that he used is so fitting, and I think it perfectly mirrored sort of the.
It's a little cheesy, but
you think so?
I think it's a little over the top, but it does work because Rorschach as a character is so extreme that you have to have this extreme character voice. I don't know. I agree. I think he was great. Like the cat, and in fact, I think casting across the board was great. But I think there was one exception that I wasn't as big a fan of, and I wonder if you had to pick one that you weren't as big a fan of, who would you pick?
I wasn't. So the only one that really struck me as I don't know. I just kind of wish that there was something deeper to the performance. Was Silk Spectre.
Okay, interesting. That was not my choice.
It's not that I thought that it was bad. It was just that I felt like, I don't know. Maybe it was the material that was given. Who could really say? But I felt like I wanted a little more. So
for me, it was Ozymandias.
Yeah, totally. I agree with that. Yeah, right off.
I think that was the weakest casting. And it's not to say he did a bad job. It was just like when you're trying to translate the character from the comics, something was lost there. It's hard to describe exactly what.
I think that there was a severe misunderstanding with Ozymandias, to get back to misunderstandings, because I think that in this he was outwardly just evil the whole way, and there wasn't any sort
very
of
evil.
There wasn't any sort of like flip side to that we got, where he was like it was kind of clear that it was in his eyes for the greater good, and there was no like success when everything was said and done. There wasn't that I did it moment, anything like that we got.
But kind of. I mean. I guess there wasn't the triumphant pose, but right. You know, we do get the moment where he turns on the TV and you see that the world is sort of uniting, and he has like a quiet moment of
I just mean that like the all we get from the character is just like pondering and like quiet and you know, scheming, ominous. And eventually ominous. And then we don't see any sort of like edge to that. I just think it was like pretty one note.
Well, and it's like we talked about with the philosophies battling each other, like some of that back and forth was gone. Instead, we got a lot more fisticuffs between them. You know what I mean? We got a lot more physical confrontation and less philosophical conversations going on.
Right. So yeah, let's move into Dr. Manhattan though, because you mentioned it. What was it specifically you were asking? Just what did I think overall?
Yeah, what did you think of Dr. Manhattan in this movie?
I think it worked for the most part. I think that I liked some of the attempts to try to play at like how he was perceiving things and how the struggles that he was having with his humanity and that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, I think overall it pretty much worked for me. I think that I would have liked to have seen maybe even more of him struggling with his humanity, because it did seem like he was pretty like checked out from the get-go. Like it seemed like he didn't really care about humanity at all throughout, and like his struggle was there, but I don't know, there was just there's so much more of a deeper understanding with the graphic novel in terms of like where he's come from, why he wants to hang on to his humanity, and like why he ultimately lets it go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with that, but I think some of the Dr. Manhattan stuff was some of my favorite stuff in the movie. So Billy Crudup, I think, was actually really good casting for this. We talked about him in our Jesus' Son, like an indie film we did a while ago, and I think I gave him some shit for maybe not being perfectly cast as the main character in that film. But I think he's a great Dr. Manhattan, and he has to do it has to be so hard. He's acting through all the CGI. He has to do everything very subtly because he's so detached. It's a big ask. And I think he really delivers. And that character could have gone really bad, you know? And instead, I think it went right. And for the most part, it was some of the strongest material. His powers were awe-inspiring. You really, like, I thought he was magnetic. And I wanted to... it was almost to a detriment to the other characters, because the Dr. Manhattan stuff was so engaging. And then he disappears for like 45 minutes in the middle of the movie. And you get a ton of Night Owl and Silk Spectre stuff, and you get Rorschach. But like once you've been introduced with this amazing character, it's hard to pull back and go to like the mundane life of the night owl in some ways. And in some ways it works against the movie because he's so compelling.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about how they achieved the actual look, because this was 2009, and you know they were able to do a lot of good CGI at that point. But in terms of like performance, motion capture stuff, normally what they would do in this time is they would shoot a scene and it would be filmed with a placeholder instead of the CGI character. So it would they would shoot it without, and they would shoot everything else without the CG element. And then they would have somebody do like motion capture on a stage somewhere and like kind of put the two together. But what they did was they kind of did motion capture on set with Billy Crudup wearing like there was a camera shooting the scene. There was a camera shooting just him for kind of reference, and there was a camera on his face for facial emotions and everything, like a sort of like, you know, the motion capture rigs that you'll see that are connected to the head with the camera out front. So they had all of that going on, and like you said, he was able to pull off their performance. And apparently, what he was wearing was also like a suit with like a bunch of blue lights all over it, so that you could kind of get the light coming off of him reacting on the set and on all the other characters and everything. So I think they cool. really went for it with the Dr. Manhattan stuff, and I thought that was cool to hear.
Yeah, and that's a convincing effect, and I was going to mention that too, because I think I had heard somewhere that they added lights to him so that you get that glow on other characters, which I think really helps sell that, right?
Definitely, yeah. I think that there's a reference that I'm wondering if you notice. I think it's a reference, at least. I noticed it and I was like, holy shit. So when they're in the bunker, the president's in the bunker, the sort of war room scenario, did you get that as a reference to Dr. Strangelove?
Absolutely. In fact, I scrolled past it in my notes and meant to go back to it. I'm glad you mentioned it though, because we can't not mention it, because we covered Dr. Strangelove for the podcast not that long ago. And my God, I was like, this is a direct reference to Dr. Strangelove, and the way it looks, the way those characters are interacting with each other, and sort of the cavalier nature. They're talking about casualties and like, all the liberals in Harvard are gonna, you know, they won't be able to the last laugh this time. It was, a blatant one in my opinion. And while I appreciated that, I guess, I don't know if it was maybe the right thing to do, but I was tickled by it. So I don't know. Is that a good thing to be tickled by a reference, or does it need to work better in the movie?
I think so. I don't think it was too. It was very clearly the reference that was being made, but I don't think that it was like in any way like disrespectful or anything like that. I think it was just literally like, we're gonna have a war room. It happens to take place in like the 80s, dealing with like Cold War type things. So maybe it could like be connected to 60s type of Cold War situation. And it just like, it's been done in tons of other movies before as well. So it's not like it's the first time it's referenced Dr. Strangelove in a war room. I got a kick out of it. I thought it was fun.
It was funny. And what about that prosthetic that actor is wearing to the Richard Nixon nose? It's kind of over exaggerated, I think, and it doesn't necessarily look like a real nose sometimes. The man had a big nose, sure, but that, I don't know.
Yeah. With age, I think certain body parts like grow, right? Nose, ears. Maybe they're trying to say that like as he got older, things changed. It doesn't look exactly like Nixon. Yeah, I don't think it looks exactly like Nixon, but yeah, I don't know. It wasn't the best practical effect for aging up somebody I've ever seen. I do want to jump back to the violence. We've talked about kind of like the glorification of violence. We talked about the superpowers they have, but I wanted to mention like specifically a couple of moments that were sticking out to me. When the Ozymandias attempted assassination happens, and like the woman gets her hand shot off and somebody's leg gets shot, and like the bones that are breaking throughout the movie. And there's a couple other moments. What's another one? Oh, so they like chainsaw a guy's arms off at one point. It's like, I understand making something like gory and over the top and crazy, but like, was that really what the story was calling for in those situations? Like, it just feels like it was over violent. It's like, I'm fine with it being.
It was sort of relishing and exulting in the violence it was depicting, whereas the graphic novel is extremely violent at times, and in particular, the end where we see the streets of New York are running with blood. Like, there's so much carnage, but it's supposed to be sort of disgusting. It's supposed to be off-putting. It's supposed to be appalling. But I agree. In a lot of those scenes, it was more like, how cool can I make this shot look of this hand exploding, and how cool would it look at like how this knee pops and explodes with blood, and Yeah, I don't
And
know.
in terms of accomplishing something in like a stunt situation, like in terms of accomplishing like cool fight scenes and things like that, it's not easy to pull off. So it is cool. It's like an
Yeah.
accomplishment, obviously.
Well, and I liked this. I'm okay with Ozymandias being sort of ninja-like. Like he kind of is
Right.
in the comics too. And I liked the way he was like ducking and diving, and the way he hit the guy was cool. But I agree with the way the bullets were hitting other characters in that scene was maybe a little, I don't know, just off tonally.
I was also jumping to like the jail cell where like I just was also going to like the over like superpowers and things like that as well, where it's like they're fighting their way down a hallway and they're just like wrecking people.
Oh,
and you're
when
like,
the Night Owl and the Silk Spectre are? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And they're just completely wrecking people. And you're like, the superpowers are just like crazy over the top. And like, I don't know. It just seems like it starts to lose sort of like any sort of tension because you're just like, they're just going to bust their way
and
through
it
this.
feels a little bit like, hey, we've had a little while without any big action scenes, so let's have
Right.
one here.
And that's what
we don't really care about the people that they're fighting. Like,
Right.
I think that's something that is a problem in a lot of Zack Snyder movies is like action without stakes often just doesn't really matter, and it's
Right.
just action for action's sake. And in those situations, that is never going to be as interesting as a scene where the action is loaded with stakes or with consequence or what have you, right?
Right. And I think that like that's what I was trying to say with sort of like, although it didn't necessarily fit with what we were trying to maybe represent, the stunts, I don't think you can say that like that it's like, you know, it's still hard to pull off. Those fight scenes are still, you know, stunts being coordinated and people having to pull it off with a camera in motion and everything. So it's like it is like a cool and interesting thing to look at, but like you said, without stakes, it kind of takes away some of the bite.
Yeah. No, I mean, it looks good. Like you watch that if you were to take that action scene, lift it from the movie and show it to someone and say, "What do you think of this action scene? Does it look cool?" They're probably going to say yes. But that doesn't mean that in the context of the story that it is this iconic scene that you're going to remember. In fact, it feels kind of more like a throwaway scene.
Yeah. So I think here we can move into sort of some of the endgame stuff. I do have some kind of production stuff that I have notes on here, but I think we should talk about the ending and how it's different and some of the other things, because that's kind of a big thing that people talk about.
Major change. That's the biggest change, I think. And I'm very curious about what your thoughts are on it. But yeah, essentially we see Dr. Manhattan return, just like he does in the graphic novel, confront Ozymandias, and then the reveal is that his plan is to have multiple devices, it seems like, detonate across the globe with an energy signature that is going to essentially frame Dr. Manhattan for these events so that humanity unites against Dr. Manhattan as a common foe, instead of the Lovecraftian squid psychic horror that is unleashed in the graphic novel, which on the surface seems sillier. I'll grant you that. So I don't know. What was your thoughts on that change? Because I guess I'm not 100% either way.
Yeah. So I am ultimately, and look, I don't know. I don't know if I'm a typical audience member when it comes to stuff like this, but like I just love weird stuff. I love interesting, unique, weird stuff. And if you can make it make sense within the story, that's exactly what I would like out of a story. So when the psychic squid shows up in the graphic novel, and because of the teleportation, the brain explodes and everybody dies. So multiple things. I think it's really cool. I think it works really well. It's interesting and unique. First off, secondly,
in what?
In the graphic novel. And but that's with the squid specifically. So the other thing with the squid is it's very specifically an alien attack. And I in terms of understanding where everything's coming together here, we are supposed to see what has been set up in the movie as an American weapon, an American asset with Dr. Manhattan attacking multiple points throughout the world. Supposedly, you know, it's obviously Ozymandias who's doing it. But if that's the way the rest of the world is thinking of it, why would they be okay with being attacked by an American weapon, even if the American weapon attacked America itself? Why would they think to be like, oh, it's okay now?
I think it's a valid question. I think that's why you see him target, you know, New York City and LA and places like that, because the carnage would be so significant that you couldn't look at America and say, well, you didn't, you know what I mean? Like you didn't suffer as much as us. Like it's bad. So maybe the expectation is that everyone would unite against it regardless.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I just think it's easier to sell, although maybe harder to sell the audience on it. It would be easier to sell people on an invasion uniting the world rather than one specific superpowered person who'd been controlled by America up to that point going off the handle and doing things. I don't know. Ultimately, it kind of achieves the same thing, but I think that the alien thing specifically makes it more clear that like everyone would come together if there was an alien attack. Whereas like this kind of leaves it a little murkier for me personally.
So I'm of two minds. Because on one hand, I agree. And one hand, I love the weirdness of the graphic novel. It went somewhere I never expected it to go. I'll give him that. But on the other hand, I do like the idea of involving our characters more and giving Dr. Manhattan another reason to leave, which he does at the end. And framing him forces him to sort of in like a sort of a Christ-like way become a martyr and say, I'll live with all of humanity thinking I did this, because I know that it's for the better, it's for their own good, and it will help preserve a peace. I'm okay with that. And so in a lot of sense, like it works storytelling wise. I will say, however, Bubastis is a big mistake, in my opinion, if you are not going to go the Psychic Squid route, because as a story beat, that pet by Ozymandias represents his ability to make these crazy hybrid creatures. And you have him present in the film, but it's never explained. What is that creature? Why does it look like that? What the hell is the point of it? And then it goes, and then it dies, and it's never explained. And instead it's this huge, like, weird moment that no one gets unless you've read the graphic novel, because it's supposed to just be an Easter egg, I guess. But it's too striking. And in the graphic novel, it works perfectly because it sets up the idea of the squid, right? Like it prepares us for this technology. In the movie, it's a completely dangling thread that goes nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of just built into his character at that point. They were like, he's got to be in it because he's in the graphic novel.
Yeah, they wanted to look the same because it looked cool. But if you put that pet there, it actually served a storytelling function in the graphic novel that no longer is present in the movie. So yeah. It's just tricky, and I think I don't think it was handled particularly well. So I think that beast, I remember when I saw it in the movie, it raised a million questions. What is that? Why does he have it? Why does he care about it? What is, I had 100 questions about that thing that then get vaporized and then nothing comes of it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
So anyway, I don't know. So like I said, I'm of two minds. I'm going to be really curious with the HBO adaptation. Do they go with there once was a giant alien squid that killed all these people, or do they go with the Dr. Manhattan supposedly punitively, I guess, punished humanity by exploding a bunch of cities, which I guess is the understanding of it. Because I don't think you can play it both ways. Like they're going to have to make a decision. And from what I understood, it was going to be more authentic to the graphic novel. But narratively, in a lot of ways, the Dr. Manhattan thing actually makes more sense.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because, I hadn't really thought of what specific... Because I had thought we were just going to go with the graphic novel ending, and we were going to push off of that. But I guess in terms of having the audience on board, how do you explain that easily and efficiently without it being like, what is happening? What happened?
Yeah. Well, because we see in the trailer, I think like there's like masks for Dr. Manhattan and stuff. So it seems to me like humanity likes Dr. Manhattan. And if humanity likes Dr. Manhattan, then that's probably not the movie version. Because I guess he's the villain.
I guess there are ways that you could have like Dr. Manhattan prove that, like, I guess, not proving, I don't know. There's a couple of things in the trailers that I don't know if I should mention in terms of relating it yet, because I don't want to spoil it if people don't want to know, but I do wonder if we'll get some sort of explaining away of if it was one way or the other, like because very clearly I think that Dr. Manhattan's going to have a role in this. I don't think he's probably going to have a huge role, and there's one specific person who's been cast that I think is a specific, maybe season 1, season 2, I don't know. Yeah, and there's somebody who's been cast that is really important to all of this stuff as well, or at least I think that that's who this person is playing. So I don't know. I think we should try to speculate at a future time or something.
I do want to say one thing about the HBO series before we finish up here. Jeremy Irons, I believe, plays Ozymandias.
That's what I didn't want to say. I'm
Why
pretty
not?
sure. Yeah.
I mean, it's in the trailers. I think it's fine.
Well, so I think that with that being the case, I think that what else does Ozymandias have to play a role in this other than the big secret that he holds?
Well, he's also the most powerful man in the world, you would assume, and this ultra rich guy who knows what he's up to these days. But I just want to. I don't know what he's going to do, but everything that I have my doubts about the casting for this movie, I do not have for Jeremy Irons. I just from what I've seen from Jeremy Irons, he is the perfect person to play Ozymandias. I'm like, yes, that nails it immediately.
He should have played Ozymandias in the film adaptation too. I would have taken that.
Maybe, honestly, like he is such a good person for that.
This is my one question that I would pose. Do you think that we get any sort of because I'm assuming we're going to get some homages or some sort of way of telling another sort of psychic squid, something really weird and crazy. I think that because it was left out of the film adaptation and because of the reaction to that, I feel like we'll see something like that in this series.
I am so excited because Damon Lindelof is a creator who continues to shock and amaze me and do things that I never predict. Just look at The Leftovers, some of the stuff that happens in that series. And yeah, I wouldn't put anything past him. You know what I mean? Maybe it is Psychic Squid. If anyone can pull it off, it's him. I maybe I'll be wrong and maybe I'll just be disappointed. But I have a lot of confidence in him as a showrunner, and I am beyond excited for this show.
So ultimately, I feel like we talked a lot of bad about this movie here. I think we tried to say some good things as well, because I definitely overall really enjoyed watching the movie. I really enjoyed the experience overall together. I do want to say a couple of things about Alan Moore and his reaction to the films and some of that kind of stuff that I
didn't read any of that.
Okay, so obviously we've talked about Alan Moore just across the board disavows anything that comes out based on his
all
his
adaptations
work.
Basically.
But I have a couple of things to read here that are kind of interesting and just I don't know what to make of them specifically, but I think that it'll be cool for the listener to formulate what you think of these on your own. So, as Alan Moore sold the movie rights to his first few volumes when he was young and naive, he regrets this, specifically for Watchmen. When asked in an interview with ReelsChannel.com about Moore's dismissal of the movie, Zack Snyder was quoted as saying, "Worst case scenario, Alan puts the movie on his DVD player on a cold Sunday in London and watches and says, yeah, that doesn't suck too bad." When this was brought up to Moore himself in a later interview in the British Tripwire Comics fanzine, the writer commented, "That's the worst case scenario? I think he's underestimated what the worst case scenario would be. That's never going to happen in my DVD player in London," in quotations, because Moore very famously lives in Northampton.
Ooh.
Which is pretty rough, yeah. And then goes on to say, "I'm never going to watch this fucking thing." Reportedly, on another occasion, a better-tempered Moore said that it's probably a good movie in its own right, but he is indifferent to movies based on his work. Still, Snyder has said that his ultimate hope is that someday Moore will actually see the film and feel it to be a decent representation of the graphic novel.
I mean, good luck pleasing that guy. Clearly, he's not into it. You know what I mean? I think he would agree with my quote I read earlier. You know what I mean? He just wants his graphic novel to be the only version of this thing that exists. And you know what? I don't feel that way about art. I wouldn't feel that way, I don't think, about something I made, but I haven't been to that situation yet. So maybe I will feel differently if I get there. But I give him credit for sticking to his guns and having a clear thing that he feels about his own art, and that it shouldn't be put into anyone else's hands, and that he wants supreme control over it, and that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. At the end of the day, you're free to feel however you want to feel, and I was saying before, if you want to idolize Rorschach, go ahead and do that. I just don't know if it's necessarily the healthiest thing to do.
Right. Well, I mean, and we talked all about how the way that these characters are shitting on liberals and stuff, and if it's not obvious, we are liberals, and so whenever they're saying that stuff, it's making us cringe, right? When they're railing against homosexuals and prostitutes and all that stuff, it goes against a lot of my worldviews. You know what I mean? And so for me, every time I hear this stuff, it makes me go, wait a minute, I don't know if I should be rooting for this character. but not everybody's going to feel that way. And some people, it's going to line up perfectly with the way they feel. And, you know, I don't know. It's in that sense, it's like a true work of art that is open for interpretation, right? Like, obviously, I'm going to have a different experience reading this than someone else on the other side of the political spectrum. So, or watching this movie, and that's okay. I think art can it doesn't have to take a stand. It can just show something and say, like, look how fucked up this world is. Look at the way these people think. Do you agree with it, or do you not? Or do you see that this has led to some of these problems, or do you think it's something else? And I think it asks questions. It asks more questions than it gives answers, I guess. In a lot of ways, that's a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. I like the idea of something. You know, you can view it from a different perspective, and maybe it changes your perspective on things. And I think that's ultimately a lot of what story is to me, or what it means to me is. Ultimately, life is just stories. Everything we do is a story eventually, and like, you know, I think that story is the best way to have different perspectives and kind of like live many different lives. So I don't know. I hope that people read it, and maybe if they do agree with some of that stuff, they start to think like, wait, maybe I don't agree with it. Like maybe Rorschach says something that is more liberal or something, and they agree with that because they like the character. I don't know. Hopefully people get whatever.
What about this? Your identity is a story about yourself that you tell to yourself. Wait, I can probably say that in a way that's a little more eloquent, but you know what I mean, right?
No, I like it. Yeah, I like
your story of your life and who you are as a person. Your identity is just a story that you're telling yourself, because there's nothing that says it has to be true in the next moment. You could completely change everything about your identity if you wanted to.
Right.
It might be hard to do, but you could theoretically do it. But instead, you stay because you say, "Oh, I'm this sort of person. I believe these sorts of things. I am someone who likes this thing and doesn't like this thing." Those are all stories we're telling about ourselves, right? And so yeah, I mean, we're getting way into the weeds here about stories. So to me, that signals that we're running out of steam on this movie. I think we should move into our end game here.
All right, let's do it. I got two little things I have to read.
Okay.
So during the opening credits, when Ozymandias is outside Studio 54, actors representing the following people appear: the Village People on the right, and David Bowie / Ziggy Stardust leaning on a car with Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones. Ozymandias reaches for Bowie to shake his hand after he turns from the cameras. So I couldn't have David Bowie be in a movie and not shout him out.
Not reference it. Okay.
Because that's my...
I didn't catch that, or I didn't identify it, that's who that was supposed to be.
It's actually cool because there's a lot of these little historical moments that are in that montage. There's like... Silhouette kissing the nurse on
I did pick up that one.
Silhouette kisses the nurse and like kind of like leans her over in the same way, taking the place of the sailor in one, you know, famous World War II photo,
right?
Where the sailor and apparently the sailor is like in the background. That was like in our version of the events, the sailor that would kiss this nurse. A lot of like really cool things happen in that.
The protests, right?
Yes.
With the flower.
Right, exactly. That's like another famous photo with putting the flower in a gun barrel.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I'm just going to rattle off some of these other things. Sally Jupiter's retirement party recreates the Last Supper, the way that she's like standing and looking out.
That was very blatant.
Right.
I was curious about that too. Like that was one for me that I was like, it went too far, like to where almost I was like, well, are they staging this for a photo op or something? Because this is too blatant. Like this is not really happen unless you're trying to do it.
Yeah, and like, what is it really saying? Like, is it saying that like, because like,
I'd be curious to see who Judas is, and that I'd have to go back and look at it because usually that's an important thing to note. If you're mimicking the Last Supper, where's Judas? You know, the stand-in for Judas. Which character is Judas? Is it Ozymandias? Is he in there? Maybe.
Oh, I mean, if it is, that really works. Or I was thinking the comedian because of like what happens, but I guess if she was retiring, so it would have already happened. The rape would have already happened, or the attempted rape, I guess.
Yeah, I don't remember. I'd have to look at a still of it.
So anyway, those are like some cool little things that were threaded in there, whether they had a huge significance or not. I think it's cool that there were like there was more thought put into it other than just a shot of this. In this montage.
That montage is great. I honestly, I just unabashedly love it.
Yep. Last thing I find really funny, Ozymandias's his suit is deliberately modeled after the infamous bat suit featured in Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin with the bat nipples, Like very specifically, it's
Why?
been said that it was like a parody. It was like a parody or like a satire of that. I don't know why, but I read that.
I don't think
and
that
I
was a
like,
good idea. I didn't like the way it looked, honestly. It
Yeah.
looked too silly to me. Like it needed,
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't like it.
Yeah.
So
Well,
we're
it
ending
was
on
there.
another thing I didn't like. Sorry. I don't know, man. As you guys could probably tell listening to this, I think we're both kind of all over the place with it.
Yeah,
And I still
conflicted.
don't know how I really feel about this movie, you know? Like,
Right.
It's just such a mixed bag.
But I do like I was saying before, I do think I'll watch it again soon. Like I think I will have watched it again eventually, and maybe revisit the graphic novel at the same time, because
I know for me,
really
I'm
enjoyed-
going to be recommending this graphic novel to people, and
Oh, yeah.
I don't know that I'm going to be recommending the movie, but I was blown away with the graphic novel, and that's my main takeaway from this project is if you like this movie at all, and you haven't read the graphic novel, do yourself a favor, pick that thing up because it is good, and it is a superior version of this story. Because it's the originator. All right, we've brought it full circle now. We've got blood on the smiley face. I think we've linked it all together, right? We should talk maybe a little bit about our plans with this HBO series. I think we've danced around the concept of covering it as like a series of episodes or something. And as much as I would love to, because we've talked about it, we're both very excited for it. But ultimately, it's not a direct adaptation. And so it would be stretching the realm, the bounds of our podcast, I think, to cover it. So what I think we're going to do is we're going to instead cover other more direct adaptations that are coming out around the same times. So we're freeing up slots for that. So, it's not like you're not getting episodes. You will be getting some. But what we're going to do is we're going to save our reaction to season 1 of the new Watchmen series as, I think, a bonus episode for our patrons at some point in the future after the entire season is over with. We could potentially change that if there's like a high demand or something. So let us know if you really don't like that, I guess. But I think that's the way we're going to go with it, just because it doesn't really feel like the main focus of our podcast is to do these like new follow-up adaptations that are happening 30 years in the future. It's just not really what we do. So I don't know. What do you think, James?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm really excited to watch the show, and like I can't wait. I'm going to be watching it week to week, and so to not have something for the podcast, I feel like would be doing it a disservice. So to do it as a bonus episode, I'm really excited for. So if that excites you, maybe think about becoming a patron and helping out the podcast. Like one of our patrons, Kelsey R. We really appreciate your support, and
New patron.
New patron also, yeah. So if you wanted to also become a patron and help the podcast continue in its current form and help us improve, go to patreon.com/ink2film and check out our options.
Absolutely. And make sure to follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Ink2Film on all three. We're also on Goodreads. We have a book club on there. So follow us all over the place. It's a good way to connect with us and interact with us, talking about the projects that we all love. So make sure to check that out.
And something I just thought about is just if you're a fan of Alan Moore stuff, I'm sure that we'll be covering more of that in the future as well. Because
that's a good point.
The V for Vendetta, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. There's a lot of stuff that even like The Killing Joke, we could think about doing in some capacity. So if you're into this, let us know, and we'd love to cover more of it in the future.
Yeah, let us know which Alan Moore project you want to see, because there are a lot of them, and we'd be excited to hear. And if you wanted to support the podcast in a way that doesn't cost you anything, ratings and reviews are our lifeblood, and giving them to us, across whatever platform you use, especially if it's on iTunes, since that's one of our biggest platforms, that helps out so much. Doesn't cost you anything other than a few seconds or maybe a minute of your time, and we would greatly appreciate it.
We wanted to thank AOE for the use of our intro and outro music, and thank you to Jennifer Delazana for providing our transcripts.
All right, man, I think it's time to put a cap on this Watchmen coverage. We do want to announce our next project. It's coming up here. It's October. It's the spooky season, and it's time to get into a little more horror. So we're returning to the king. We're going back to the well, and we are going to be covering Dr. Sleep in advance of the movie coming out next month. We're going to start our way into the novel. We're going to be covering the first half of the novel of Dr. Sleep for our following episode. So make sure you come back next week for that. Hopefully all you Stephen King fans will be happy and excited for this as we are. We hope you join us for that.
I can't wait. I just, like I said last time, I don't know what to expect. I actually may have said that in our reading prompt. So, I mean, I don't know what to expect. I'm really excited. what are we going to get? I know Danny's in it. That's all I know. So here we go.
Right. All right. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.